So speaking of which, let's talk about Heraclius. He didn't make he didn't make your list either, which is a shocker for a lot of people. Perhaps you can describe the nuance of that, but he took over the Roman Empire on the verge of extinction. Persians at the gates, treasury empty. So maybe first tell the full saga of the Roman-Persian War that threatened the empire's existence.
Sure. Well, he wasn't entirely, you know, free of blame for the situation that he inherited.
Mhm.
He was in part responsible for it. So he doesn't get a pass on that.
Mhm.
So Heraclius is basically a rebel and a usurper. For various reasons, Rome and Persia are at war starting around 602. And the Persian Shah at this time, Khusro II, has basically decided on a policy of conquest, not just raiding. Like, I'm going to go in and take your people, some cattle and some statues, and take them to, Mesopotamia. He starts I think there's some evolution in his thinking and his planning about this, but pretty soon during the 600 and the aughts, he realizes that there's potential for actual permanent territorial gain here, and his armies start moving in. And the Roman emperor is this guy called Phocas, who is himself a usurper, a military background. And he now faces a rebellion by Heraclius, whose base is in North Africa at this time, like around Carthage. And they have a civil war for 3 years, 608 to 610.
Mhm.
That civil war that Heraclius initiates causes a diversion of Roman armies to the civil war away from the Persian front. So it's a massive gift to the Persians. Plus, a lot of the fighting takes place in Egypt. And Egypt was a province that had, up until that point, not really been harmed by war. Now it is. Right? So Heraclius' forces, he's not in Egypt, but his backers are fighting a civil war in Egypt. So that province is now, ravaged in part. The Persians make tremendous gains in the east. Heraclius heads straight for Constantinople during all of this. And to make a long story short, he manages to take Constantinople, execute Phocas, and become emperor. Right? But now he's facing a problem that's much worse than it was before he started the rebellion. The reason why Heraclius is sort of lionized actually, there's a very long tradition of doing this, which goes back to the Middle Ages. In the Western Middle Ages, Heraclius was sometimes considered like the first crusader.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So there's all this medieval literature about Heraclius as being a proto-crusader type and all of that. For reconquering like Jerusalem from the Persians and restoring the true cross and all that. So he had this kind of aura. And I think his modern admirers are basically just continuing. I mean, they might not know it, but they're kind of continuing this very, very long tradition of treating Heraclius as this heroic holy warrior. Mm-hmm. Anyway, from my standpoint, it's a complete wash. In other words, yes, he does beat the Persians, and he gets, like, in my view, full credit for that, though he did it with, I think, the help of some Turkish allies from Central Asia. These were, I think, the major component of his success at the very end. But no. So he held the Persians off and ultimately defeated them, yes. And then he loses everything to the Arabs.
So the Arab conquests are 630s and 640s, but the Persian War is 602 to 628.
Yes.
So what can be said about this, what seems to be a pretty costly war against Persians?
So the war was costly initially only for the Romans. The eastern provinces were conquered by Persia. That means Syria, Palestine, Egypt. So that's a loss. Mm-hmm. You lose all that revenue. And then they start raiding into Asia Minor. Yes. By the way, this is exactly what the Arabs would do, just a couple decades later. They would conquer Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and they would start raiding into Asia Minor. So almost like this phase of East Roman history begins already during the Persian invasion. It's just a kind of a prelude. It was, in fact, the Arabs that would do that for the next few centuries. So Heraclius, it takes him a very long time to get organized. In fact, something like 15 years. And it's not entirely clear like what he's doing all this time. But he ultimately manages to defeat the Persians by waging these really spectacular, weird campaigns in the east. He decides to strike into the Persian heartland, as it were. Well, first in the Caucasus region, and then he goes into Mesopotamia. So not to try to defeat their armies that are rampaging around Asia Minor or even besieging his capital in 626. The Persians and the Avars, this people from this nomadic warrior group that's settled in roughly modern Hungary. They're besieging Constantinople. Heraclius doesn't even go. And he's just kind of preparing his armies in the east. And he strikes the Persians right where it hurts. And this now begins to degrade the Persian heartland and their infrastructure. Because remember, both of these empires are going to be in shambles by the time the Arabs come along. And this is what enables the Arabs to conquer them so quickly. I mean, they've destroyed each other in these wars. And eventually Heraclius calls in his Turkish allies, and they go on a field trip through Mesopotamia. And this causes a coup in Persia, and Khusro is killed.
Is there something to be said, a little bit of texture to the motivations of the different empires and the different groups involved? So the East Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and the Islamic Caliphates, were they after conquering? Were they after expansion? Were they after more like raiding for financial benefits? What was the motivation?
So in the past, the Persian Shahs basically were interested in raiding. And they also had an interest in manpower. So all of those Mesopotamian agricultural estates won't till themselves. So they were kind of insatiable for agricultural workforces and specialized craftsmen and people like that. So they would go into the empire and get them. But in this phase, it seems that Khusro II is taking really to heart the idea that the Persian Empire should really extend to the Mediterranean, as it did in like Achaemenid times, right? In ancient history, the empire that Alexander conquered. So it seems that the Sasanians, this is this dynasty, this Iranian dynasty that's ruling the Persian Empire. Of course, they were aware of the Achaemenids, but sometimes they would have these claims to reviving the former greatness of the Iranian Empire.
Sure.
So, bathing in the Mediterranean Sea is something that many Near Eastern monarchs, they did this as a sign of success. Anyway, for the Romans, it was sheer survival. Just desperate survival, because they knew that this was a war that could end the Roman state.
I mean, they're already on the verge of being ended.
Yeah.
And here they're defensive wars of survival.
Yeah. So it's pretty clear that initially the goal of Arab-Muslim warfare is to unify Arabia. That is, that all Arabs should be Muslim and should be unified into this religious kind of state, whatever, that the Prophet and his successors had created. Now, then they start striking out into Rome and into Iran. It's not entirely clear, like, why. Now, there are obvious reasons. Right? I mean, it's not like a huge historical mystery why a recently formed successful army will decide to take on two very weak opponents who are on their doorstep. Like, this is not complicated.
Yeah, they're pretty effective at military conquest.
Yeah, but they're striking both empires from a direction that those empires had never prepared to defend from. Arabia was just not. Oh, you might get some occasional raiders. You're never going to get an army that's coming out that can potentially conquer you. So the defensive orientations are all wrong. And these two empires have gone through this massive war that has destabilized them. They're low on manpower, low on resources. The outcome is almost kind of inevitable. I don't think there's a great mystery.
And the effect of that is they stripped away the richest provinces of the Roman Empire.
Yes, Egypt in particular. That means now you can't feed Constantinople. Like we talked about the grain from Egypt, right, that came to Constantinople. You don't have that now. And so that means that the population of Constantinople will decline dramatically over the next few decades.
So how does the empire rebuild itself, restabilize? Because it doesn't collapse there, right?
Yes.
It survives. There's interesting low points for the empire where it still survives.
This is one of them.
And that is as interesting as the survival at the top and the flourishing survival at the bottom is also super interesting. So what happens? How does it kind of stabilize?
Very slowly. This is a painful process, and it takes them centuries, you could say.
Yeah.
First, you got to stop the bleeding. Just try to hold a line. It takes them decades to hold a line. Like they get pummeled by the Arabs for decades in the 7th century until finally by 660s, 670, they finally begin to beat them on land and hold a line on the sea. And so we now have an investment in fleets. Eventually you get the Greek fire, which is the flamethrowers. And when the Arabs try to take Constantinople, these attempts are defeated like twice. And that ensures the survival of the Roman state in some form.
How were the flamethrowers used?
Yes, this is an interesting question. We're still kind of debating that.
Oh, it's not fully understood.
Well, it's a state secret. They didn't want this getting out, so they kept it pretty well. The fact that we're debating it will tell you that they were pretty good at keeping secrets. So possibly through a pressure valve, right? So you have this flammable compound whose preparation and components is also a state secret. So there's a corps of engineers that prepares this and deploys it. And it's possibly through a heated, pressurized container with a spigot, let's say, that unleashes this thing through a nozzle, and it's lit and basically spews flaming napalm on other ships. And it will continue to burn even when it's on the water, right, on the top. So, like, you can't, like, swim away or anything. So it's this very, very destructive weapon. Terrifying. They used it against Vikings, too. This is much later. So once the Vikings show up, like when they would attacked Constantinople in the 940s, then again in the 1040s, the Romans used Greek fire fleets to just incinerate and that'll teach Vikings. Yes, if you're in that situation, you'd rather serve under the emperors than attack them.
And so this is a kind of nuclear weapon level state secret.
They even had it in hand grenade form.
This is a real thing?
Oh, yes.
Hand grenade form.
Yes. So it's like a clay container with the compound, and it has like some sort of fuse that you light on the outside and you throw it. Now, you can throw it against people, but it's not going to be that effective. Maybe you burn a person, whatever. You just wasted a hand grenade for one person. It's most effective against things like siege engines. So you throw that on a wooden frame and,
This is incredible. So this is one of the things that's finally stabilized, stopped the bleeding from a military perspective.
Yeah, eventually. Now remember, they've pulled the armies back into Asia Minor. So they're beginning to defend and fortify Asia Minor. Now you have to find ways to pay and support and feed all of these soldiers. And this is a whole it's a wrenching administrative readjustment. But they go through it. It takes them a long time. Eventually they emerge with a different kind of strategic logistical system.
Just a smaller, harder core of the empire.
That's right. Very militarized.
Very militarized. And then in the 8th century, the second Arab siege of Constantinople that somehow fails.
In the early 8th century, yes, that was the second siege.
Yeah, the early 8th century. So why did it fail? Can you tell the story of that siege? That was really the empire hanging by a thread.
Yes, but it happened to have a very competent man in charge. This is Leo III, and he's an emperor who he's a usurper. He's just seized power. They knew that this massive Arab attack was coming. And so it's quite possible that the Roman elites, preferred to put someone capable in power at that moment. The city was very well prepared. I encourage people in the audience to go and read the sources that we have for that. You can find many accounts of it online. It was just very, very well done. He also had Bulgar allies. So these are the Bulgars who had just crossed the Danube, just like just a few years earlier, actually, and settled south of the Danube, where eventually, Bulgaria emerged. So he had Bulgar allies, and he used the Greek fire very, very strategically. He used his own fleet. He contained the Arabs to certain places where they kind of starved and wore them down. It's just very well done.
From a military perspective.
Well,
was it the walls, the navy, the weather, the diplomacy, just good luck that helped Constantinople hold?
I don't see much role for good luck there. I mean, I think he had it all pretty planned out. It was all of the elements that you mentioned. And yeah, he just deployed them very, very astutely. And went on to rule after that for another 20-some years. And his son continued. They formed a dynasty. We call it the Isaurian dynasty, though they were not from Isauria.
And then from that, the fascinating thing that we mentioned about religion, there was a whole stretch of time marked by intense internal religious conflicts over iconoclasm. Maybe you can clarify this, but so iconoclasm, of course, is whether sacred images, icons, should be venerated or destroyed. This had major political and theological stakes. The seemingly smallest things can have the biggest of conflicts.
Yeah. You've been in an Orthodox church.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen all the icons and the just painting everywhere?
Mm-hmm.
Every space that you can imagine is covered in either icons or images or iconography of saints.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that's a result of this. No, that's not what Christian churches used to be like, at least not in Constantinople. But his dynasty basically tried to limit or remove images from churches, and ultimately that policy failed. And the other side that wanted images or liked images, let me put it differently, thought that images were not only appropriate but helpful in the context of Christian worship, prevailed. And so gradually the churches began to fill up with icons, lots of icons. They're almost like, like a catchword for Orthodox, devotion. I have icons at home. You have a little corner in the house. You have little iconography.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I mean, as a secular Orthodox person, but even I can't get away from it.
But that has serious consequences. I mean, there was serious.
Yes.
It was an extremely serious internal religious conflict.
Well, okay. So, one asterisk on that. In my research, I did not find popular interest in this matter. Like,
oh, interesting.
Yeah, I don't.
So this is an overblown.
Yes, socially completely overblown.
Oh, this is one of those things where religious folks will write the story of history.
That's it. Got it.
Ah,
you got it. I could not find. There were like a few emperors, and there's some bishops and abbots and monks. Like, I don't know, maybe 100, 200 people are like seriously invested in this, and they're going at it. But these are the people who write the texts. But they never mention, for example, that, the people of Constantinople, they rose up and they demanded icons or not icons or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
No, never. So, in my view, this is one of those controversies that's only a few people really cared about it. And unfortunately, they're the ones who wrote the sources.
So you always have to be very careful to consider the sources when you're reading about anything involving religious events.
Or any kind of events.
But certain things are more intensely, people are more intensely passionate about, and therefore that bias is going to bleed into the way you report the history.
Yeah. And not only that, when emperors changed their policy, almost everyone fell into line. Like, switched positions. It's like, no, yeah, whatever. Put the images, take the images, like, whatever. They did not see this as central. Some people did, and they got very worked up about it. Anyway, but in the end, the pro-icon position won, and their view just began to fill up the space. Like it literally was filling up the churches. And it still does.